Oh, and then you need a camera on yourself too.
No, I'll just transition.
Oh.
I know this person.
They don't matter because
Out of the, yeah.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I think we're going to get started. Thanks for everyone's patience online while we're getting settled in the room. I just want to welcome you all to your event, to our event. I'm Enrico Castillo. I'm one of the Associate Residency Program Directors in Psychiatry. I'm also the faculty lead for Community Global Psychiatry. We call it CGP. So this event is organized by two groups in our Psychiatry Residency Program, CGP, and also Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And it's also sponsored and organized by Med Students for Choice. So our organization, CGP, we've been holding these policy and change events since 2018. These events, they combine education on a topic related to health and social inequities, but they also, it's combined with direct action, direct policy action that we do in the room, short-term and long-term advocacy actions as well. So we started doing these events for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that we wanted to highlight that inequities are happening all around us, unfortunately. They're affecting our patients, they're affecting our communities. And so it's so important that advocacy and structural action are part of our everyday work and our roles as physicians, our healthcare workers, or other roles as well. The second reason is to emphasize that in order to do structural action, it's critical that we learn from multiple disciplines and also from community-based organizations. And that's a really important part of this event. So lastly, past events, they focused on topics like ending jail expansion in LA, family separations at the border, the deplorable conditions in ICE detention centers locally, and also decriminalizing homelessness. So I'm really excited to turn it over to Jen and Hillary, who's going to introduce this topic on reproductive health, rights, and justice. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, I wanted to just introduce myself. I'm Jen. I'm a third-year psychiatry resident at UCLA and also co-chief resident of the Community and Global Psychiatry Group. I'll have Hillary introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Hillary, also a third-year psychiatry resident at UCLA, and with Jen, co-chief of the CGP group. We want to thank all of you for joining us today. We're very excited to be able to have this space to learn from people who are well-versed and also just have some space to be able to talk. We want to go ahead and just start with some brief introductions. While the people in the room are sharing, if people on Zoom want to write into the chat and kind of send, I think just generally your name, maybe what department you're from and your role in that department. And we'll just begin here maybe with our panelists.
Please.
Okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Katie Unverfurth. I'm a reproductive psychiatrist here at UCLA. I direct our UCLA maternal mental health program, which comprises a perinatal IOP and PHP, so really a day program for pregnant and postpartum women. And then I also direct the Women's Life Center, which is our outpatient psychiatry center or clinic, really, where we see women during reproductive transition. So it tends to be PMDD or premenstrual dysphoric disorder, maybe anxiety or depression or mental health issues arising from fertility or infertility, pregnancy, postpartum, and menopause. I also have a private practice in Santa Monica. So, hi, glad to be here.
Hi, everyone. I am Jennifer Gandhi. I am a fourth-year psychiatry resident here at UCLA. I am also the chief in the Women's Life Clinic that Dr. Unverfurth was just talking about. So I see those patients as well there. And I am very happy to be here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Cohen, and I am a staff attorney with the UCLA Law Center on Reproductive Health Law and Policy. We are a new interdisciplinary research and policy center at the law school, focused on publishing, again, interdisciplinary research to aim current debates in reproductive health law and policy, and also, of course, to engage with students and train the next generation of repro activists and lawyers.
And then I think our third panelist is on Zoom, if you want to introduce yourself, Xochitl.
Yes, thank you. My name is Xochitl Lopez Ayala. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the policy advocacy coordinator for California's only abortion fund, Access Reproductive Justice. I'm also on the board for the Northwest Abortion Access Fund, and I am just so excited and happy to be here. And I wanted to note that since this is a hybrid event, for folks that are in the room, I gave the links and resources that I'm going to drop in the chat for Zoom to the hosts, so that way they can be shared with you all later. So thank you.
All right, and we can also have some of our attendees here in person introduce themselves and tell us what department you're from, what your role is, and you can just keep brief introductions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shauna Chan. I'm one of the psychiatry residents in this program. I'm also in the Women's Life Center with Dr. Reproductive and Jen Gandhi.
Hey everyone, my name is Rohit, pronouns he, him, his. I'm also a third-year resident. I'm in Women's Life and I'm a Jedi co-chief.
I'm Maya. I'm a med student visiting for UCLA and psychiatry.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a first-year law student.
I'm Ronan Hallowell. I'm a faculty member at the Keck School of Medicine and USC, and a social and learning scientist, and I direct our Health, Justice, and Systems of Care course and work with my colleagues here at the Center for Social Medicine and Humanities.
I'm Daniel Kobe. I'm a sixth-year behavioral neurology fellow and interested in law, medicine, and the interaction of policy.
All right. Great. I love that we have people from such different disciplines all here together. It's really nice. So thank you all so much for joining us for our policy and change event centered around reproductive health justice. We're going to start off the event with a talk from Dr. Jen Gandhi. She'll be talking about the Turnaway study, which described the effects of being denied abortions on women's mental health. We will also be hearing from each of our panelists as they speak about abortion access from legal and community perspectives. After that, we will have a Q&A. So I really want to encourage you all to think of some questions as we go along. We're hoping this will be an open discussion. So we encourage your participation. And finally, at the end of our Q&A, we will be reviewing an action sheet together, and that will describe steps for us to get involved and to make an impact. Okay, so we'll begin with Dr. Gandhi now.
Thank you. So the Turnaway study is, as Jen mentioned, is a very large multi-center study that looked at the impacts of either receiving or being denied an abortion over quite a long period of time. And they studied a lot of different outcomes, including mental health outcomes. So the paper that I'm going to discuss today is just in regards to the longitudinal results from the mental health outcomes of the study. So there's a lot more there, and I'm just going to be talking about a small slice of it. I did share the paper with the host, so that'll be in the action sheet, I believe. So in 1989, the US Surgeon General's office basically came out with a statement saying that we really don't know the impacts of abortion on women. And a lot of our policy, basically without very much data, was assuming that abortions could have a negative impact on women who received them. So there were some studies, some limited literature, but there were a lot of methodologic issues with those previous studies. And so this study had kind of a very interesting design that could help with some of the methodologic issues that we run into when we can't do randomized controlled trials. And what they did was they used this idea of there being a gestational limit cutoff for when you can receive an abortion based on the state that you live in and the laws in that state, and looked at women who approached abortion clinics just before that cutoff and just after that cutoff to see if there were differences in those women, because they either received the abortion if they were before the cutoff or did not because they were too late for that cutoff. And so that allows for a pseudo experimental design. If you're really familiar with statistics, it's like a regression discontinuity design. The participants of the study were recruited from 30 abortion clinics across 21 states. And the way that they picked those specific clinics was that they looked in a 150-mile radius of that clinic and made sure that it had the latest gestational limit. And this was to sort of pick the clinic where the participants who may have been turned away from like another clinic, could go to that clinic. That would be like the one in that area. There were still some people who were turned away from that clinic that may have gotten an abortion elsewhere, and I'll talk about that shortly, but that was to prevent that issue. So there were, it was a survey design. So there was a baseline interview for the participants, and then an interview 1 week after they either received the abortion or they were denied their abortion, and then every 6 months thereafter for 5 years. So it was a pretty long-term study. There were some questions about demographics, physical and mental health, childbearing experiences and intentions, history of traumatic life events. So it was a pretty rich interview. Women who were trying to get an abortion because of fetal abnormalities or medical conditions were excluded from the study. So these were, not those abortions. The three groups that are relevant are the people that were before the cutoff. They call them the near limit group. The people that were just after the cutoff, 3 weeks after, that was called the turnaway group. And then the first trimester group, they also included a group of people who came during their first trimester to get an abortion. And for all of these clinics, I believe that was an abortion that they could get. So the turnaway group was further subdivided into two groups, one in which they did give birth, and then another one in which they either miscarried after desiring an abortion or later had an abortion elsewhere. So they call those two groups, I'm just giving you the terminology because I'll use it later, the turnaway birth group and then the turnaway no birth group. So the main comparison groups that I'm going to be talking about is the near limit group, those just before the cutoff, and the turnaway birth group. And then the outcome variables that I'm going to talk about from this paper are the depression and anxiety scores. They come from a brief symptom inventory questionnaire, and they looked at like folks just responses to whether they had symptoms of depression and anxiety, and then they also categorized them as having depression and anxiety if they were above a certain threshold of those symptoms. There was a couple other outcome variables that I'm going to talk about too, which were measures of well-being, and they were just one question each about someone's self-esteem and their life satisfaction, which we would imagine captures something similar, but not the same as depression and anxiety. So both of those were included. I can talk more about like the methods, but I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the results. 37% of the participants that were eligible actually consented to participate in this study. And then 84.5% of those completed the baseline interview, and there was some attrition so that by the end of the study, there was a retention rate of like 58% at the last interview. So basically the results of this study show that when they looked at the responses to the anxiety and depression's answers at 1 week after someone was either denied an abortion or they received the abortion that they desired, depression and anxiety were both a little bit higher in the group that was turned away, that was denied the abortion. But over time, over the course of the 5 years and the 11 interviews that they did, the rates of depression and anxiety in both groups went down. Baseline self-esteem was lower among the women in the turnaway groups than the near limit group, and then self-esteem also improved over time in all groups. And so the authors conclude from this study that that they add evidence to this body of smaller literature before this, that having an abortion does not increase a woman's risk of experiencing adverse psychological outcomes, which was important because at the time, 9 states, at the time meaning in 2016 when the study was published, 9 states had laws that women were required, who sought an abortion were required to go through counseling to advise them that there may be adverse psychological outcomes. But this study showed that is not only not true based on this study, but also might be the opposite, that women who were denied an abortion may have adverse psychological outcomes. The authors kind of suggest that it's unwanted pregnancy, because both groups had some depression and anxiety. It's unwanted pregnancy that leads to lower life satisfaction and self-esteem in that immediate period, not whether you received or were denied the abortion, or not the abortion itself. And so that was another important finding. And then they also found, which I didn't present the results of this, but women with a history of mental health conditions and trauma were at higher risk of having worse mental health outcomes after denial of an abortion than if they received a wanted abortion, which I think is really important too. And so I think that the importance of this study is that, it does not provide any evidence to justify that laws requiring women seeking an abortion to have counseling about these potential negative psychological responses, it's not justified based on this study.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Gandhi. For Dr. Unverforth, we have a question, which is, as a psychiatrist specializing in women's mental health, could you speak to the human toll of being denied an abortion or obstructions to abortion access?
Yeah. So I think when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about my patients who have gone through something like this. I think the majority of my patients in California have benefited from access to abortions when they wanted them on their terms. That might be also because the majority of my patients have commercial insurance, right? And so they have access to this when they need it. Of my patients who have gotten it, it seemed like becoming pregnant really precipitated mental health crises for some of them. So there used to be this idea that, like very Freudian, that women who had anxiety or depression during pregnancy had like pathological ambivalence about becoming a mother, right? So they were sort of blamed for not wanting to become a mother in some ways. And I think what we know now is that there's a huge hormonal component to the experience of pregnancy, especially for our women with a history of anxiety and depression, which is the majority of the patient population that I treat. And so a few of my patients really had mental health crises precipitated by pregnancy, which led to psychiatric hospitalizations for suicidality. And in both of their cases, ultimate decision to terminate the pregnancy so that they could eventually choose to have a pregnancy on their own terms in the future when they were in a better place mentally. And what we know from some of the results of the Turnaway study as well is that those who choose to terminate do go on to have better bonding with their baby in the future when they have a pregnancy on their own terms than those who are forced to keep the pregnancy. And so I think that's important. I think, you know, when we're thinking about pregnancy and we're thinking about the human experience of pregnancy, for many people, it's experienced as a huge loss of control over their body at baseline, right? If you just think about it, like your body's changing in ways that you can't control, right? You're experiencing all of these new feelings that you can't control. Nothing like pregnancy to bring out all of these like old issues that you thought you had put to rest from like a psychological or mental health perspective, right? Huge shifts in family dynamics are happening, right? You're adding a third person or a second person, depending, right? It's this huge shift. And so it's a loss of control already, whether or not it's planned. So to add in that it might have been unintended, and then to imagine being denied a wanted abortion, right? You can't like imagine how traumatic that might be, right? I think that, you know, we know that even in perinatal psychiatry, meaning like the treatment of pregnant and postpartum women, there used to be this idea that women were mentally well during pregnancy, that it was like a period of euthymia, meaning like a period of mental wellness, right? And in some ways, women were encouraged to come off psychiatric medications that had stabilized them because they were going to be okay during pregnancy. And it wasn't really until about 20 years ago that we had like a landmark study that really showed that for women with a history of depression and anxiety, pregnancy is not a protected time. And for the general population, pregnancy is not a protected time from a mental health perspective. You know, so it's really only recently that, you know, we've been educating more, and like, you know, nationally, there's a lot more education about, you know, it's important to prioritize the mother's mental health and the well-being of the fetus, right? You have to keep both in mind, but a lot of people, I think, feel very disempowered or get misinformation, you know, come off of all your medications, grin and bear it. They have this idea that that's safer, and we have a lot of data to support that that's not actually safer. I think other things that I wanted to say just to think about this is, you know, when we're looking at the population who was presenting to the Turnaway study, so these women who were kind of presenting for late term or later abortions, the majority had been using contraception. So the majority of those patients, it's not that they were irresponsible, the majority were trying to take care of their reproductive health in the way that they wanted, right? So like they were using barrier or hormonal methods. Just over a third were not using contraception, but the majority were. And I think that's important. I think there's this misconception, especially in certain political circles, that, you know, they're not taking care of it, or they're not trying, or they got themselves into this mess, not understanding that it's chance, right? And then of those who do seek abortions, you know, additionally, 2 of 5 report issues accessing contraception, which I think is a huge area of intervention. And 1 of 5 report they ran out in the month before becoming pregnant. So it's very common that in the month before an unintended pregnancy, there can also be issues with access to contraception. And again, I think that's an important place for policy and activism to really get a foothold. Other things. Oh, I think another thing that I want to talk about is why people have abortions. Majority are financial. So 40% report that financial reasons are one of the reasons they want an abortion. And we know that in the Turnaway study, those who were denied an abortion had significantly harder financial outcomes than those who received an abortion. And some reported having trouble already at baseline, having trouble paying for basic living expenses. And then those who were denied the abortion were more likely to end up in poverty, right? So raising a child is very expensive, especially in the US, where we don't really have that social support network, right? Other reasons people wanted abortions was that it wasn't the right time for a baby. And then also that they didn't feel mentally or emotionally ready, right? Lots of reasons. Another reason was partner-related reasons. And I think that this is important too, is that people who are in relationships with intimate partner violence sometimes wanted a termination in that setting. And we found out that those who were denied abortions had more contact with an abusive partner for longer. So again, I think it just I spoke about a lot of things, but like lots of reasons, I think, to really support women in having the access and support for whatever decision they want to make regarding their healthcare. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. We're going to shift speakers now to our community partner, Ms. Xochitl Lopez Ayala. And she is going to talk a little bit about their organization and also what we had a question for her about the Dobbs decision and how the messages that Access Reproductive Health has heard from the people that you serve. I'm learning a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Okay, there we go. So thank you again for having me here. I use she, her pronouns, and like many folks, we saw a lot of shock and people wanting to get involved, and abortion funds and folks in reproductive justice work have already been navigating a post-Roe world, from waiting periods. They talked about mandatory counseling, as well as having to travel in like gestational age deserts of healthcare in our community. And I would like to also preference that, like, when we use the word reproductive justice, it is defined by Sister Song as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And when we use reproductive justice, or RJ, it's not a synonym for abortions for people of color. It doesn't mean organizations led by people of color, and it's not a synonym for reproductive rights, which is a framework that focuses on ensuring legal rights, but not necessarily ensuring accessibility. And when we use the term reproductive justice, a social justice and an intersectional analysis have to be applied, meaning that we address how race, class, gender identity, immigration status, disability, location, and other levels of oppression all impact our experiences in obtaining reproductive health care. I would also like to point out that with the decision that came out, we don't need to go camping. We don't need an auntie network. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, as there's been a network of abortion funds and practical support volunteers and advocates who are already working tirelessly to make every community a safe haven for those seeking access to abortion. And by using those terms, it brings in a white saviorism of cis white women and erasure of the work that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as LGBTQ+ folks have been doing.
Great, thank you so much. And I think another question we had for you is how can we best support community organizations such as Access Reproductive Justice?
The best way that folks can support organizations that are dealing in reproductive health, the biggest one is help end abortion stigma. Say the word abortion. If you feel comfortable to share your story, a function of abortion stigma just encourages people to believe that abortions are a bad word and it needs to be concealed. And we only liberate abortion from stigma and shame by saying the word abortion. And by saying safe, legal, and rare, those kind of words are stigmatizing and contend that abortion is not something that should be happening. But there are going to be as many abortions as there needs to be. And so by saying the word abortion, we eliminate that stigma, because at the end of the day, everyone loves somebody that's had an abortion. And by saying that in your normal conversations, you can start to destigmatize it. We also are looking for folks who want to get involved in terms of advocacy in terms of testifying at your local and state legislator, city councils. And so I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to our application that if you feel like you want to get involved and share your story of abortion access, or how like your awesome pregnancy went and you didn't need an abortion, like those are all stories in pregnancy outcomes that need to be shared. And the most important tool that you have is your voice and you speaking up in terms of advocacy, and just showing up today is a big step. So thank you all for being here.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to shift to our final panelist, Ms. Cathren Cohen. And she is going to tell us about the legislative work being done to support access to abortion.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks again for having me on this panel. I'm here to talk from a lawyer perspective, so please rein me in if I get too wonky on that. I wanted to speak a little bit about sort of the legislative opportunities and all the bills working their way currently through the California state legislature to protect and expand access to abortion. And this is actually a really fantastic time to be having this event because today is the last day of the legislative session. And there is a voting marathon going on. The representatives fighting for these bills are expected to be on the floor through midnight and maybe even later. And so while that's sort of ending a little bit of a time period in terms of getting involved in some of the legislation, as I'll talk about, there's going to be a lot of opportunities next session. And then for the next month, the governor is going to have a ton of bills on his desk having to do with reproductive health care. And there's definitely opportunities for folks if you want to get involved in advocacy towards the governor. I wanted to first introduce, and I believe that this is in the action sheet, but I can also circulate it after, the California Future of Abortion Council, because a lot of these legislative proposals came out of recommendations that that organization, or really that convening, wrote into a report last year, recognizing that the Supreme Court agreeing to take this case meant that Roe was likely going to be overturned or gutted. California leadership in our government recognized that we needed to start acting even before that happened in order to protect abortion access. And as I'll talk about, we have really strong protections in California, but this report identified a number of gaps. And the folks who came together for the Future of Abortion Council were representatives from over 40 reproductive health and rights organizations and other groups, stakeholders that are involved in other issues that affect reproductive justice. It's a really helpful framework to think about the kind of coalition coming together here. And in the report that is, I see now, I think in the chat, or it's on that website, there's many more legislative proposals that will be introduced in future years. But for this year, there were 15 bills having to do with reproductive health care and access that were working their way through the state legislature. The last time I checked, which was a little bit before we started this panel, there were 11 of those that had been sent to the governor's desk, really like in the last week, because this is when the legislature is wrapping up, and that's just kind of the timeline of when things get sent. There are already 2 laws that have been signed into effect by the governor. One is eliminating cost sharing for people for abortion, regardless of insurance coverage. And the one that the bill I'm going to talk about a lot, and that I think we have some advocacy around, is also sort of about affordability. So I wanted to mention that one. And the other one that the governor signed the day that the Dobbs decision came down is prohibiting any sort of civil liability for people who have abortions. And so just really like protecting legally the rights that already exist against really attacks from other states. And so one big bucket of those 11 bills that I mentioned, or I guess there's 13 of them that are still not signed yet, 11 that have been passed through both of the chambers and are with the governor. And then there's 2 more that they might get to the governor by 1 a.m. tonight. One big bucket of those bills is strengthening protections for providers, patients, and then also supporters of abortion access who either are in California or will come to California for abortion. And a lot of these, as you'll see, have to do with people traveling from state to state. Now that we have had Roe v. Wade overturned, more than half of the states in the country have or are expected to ban or really severely restrict abortion. And we recently published a study that found that anywhere between 8,000 to 16,000 people
will be coming to California every year for abortion care from these states where it's been banned. So thinking about people who are going to be coming from other states, how our state is going to respond to that influx and that strain really on the capacity of providers, and also to protect people in California from laws in states that are really restrictive and trying to punish people for providing or helping people get abortions has been a big theme kind of in these legislative bills. In addition to kind of protections against those lawsuits from out of states, there is, I guess, like 3 kind of other categories of bills. One has to do with workforce development and making sure that we are increasing the number of people who can provide abortions. Some of those have to do with particularly creating a pipeline and funding for people from either underserved populations or who are planning to serve underserved localities and communities in order to pay for their education or to pursue reproductive health care in populations that don't currently have really good access to care. Another one that I think is really interesting that has been sent to the governor's desk is one that will clarify the requirements for nurse practitioners to be able to provide abortion without physician oversight. There have been a lot of studies that show that nurse practitioners can just as safely and effectively provide abortion, both with medication and kind of earlier second trimester. I don't want to say surgical because it's not really surgery, but like a vacuum aspiration abortion. Nurse practitioners who have received adequate training have just as good of outcomes than those as physicians. And California is taking steps to allow for nurse practitioners to be able to do that without having to have a physician oversight, which is really exciting. Another category is about kind of like financial support from the state. There are a number of programs that are either specifically trying to create systems for training people, for providers, or for focusing on specific community health clinics or different locations that people who don't have regular access to health care or might not have good insurance can go and get care, increasing the resources for people for those kinds of centers. And then I'll also note that there is, our governor has committed $200 million this year in the budget to expanding access to reproductive health care. So we're really lucky to be in a state in this moment that is really taking this seriously. And again, it's really important because with the influx of people, that's going to actually also affect the quality of care that people who live in California are able to get as well. And then the fourth category is about kind of like centralizing information. They're creating an online website where you can go and get all of the information you need about how to get an abortion based on where you are in your pregnancy and where you're located, or are you in another state that potentially has one of these laws that could open you up to a lawsuit. All that information will be centralized in one place and also be tied in with an abortion fund information for people, again, who wouldn't maybe be able to cover the cost of an abortion. So a lot of stuff. I wanted to talk about one in particular that I know that folks are gonna do some advocacy around at the end of this session, which is AB 2134. And that kind of goes under the budget category, I would say. This bill is called the California Abortion and Reproductive Equity, or CARE Act. And the goal is to really fill in the gaps in between employer-based insurance and Medi-Cal for people who are low income, but may not be able to pay for the full cost of their abortion. And so what it creates is a grant program that anybody who is a Medi-Cal qualified provider can apply for, and they can receive funds in order to cover abortion, either the full cost or a part of the cost, for anybody who is not enrolled in Medi-Cal, but is at or below 400% of the poverty line. And then there's also some inclusion for people who might have employer-based insurance, but maybe work for a religious employer and their insurance doesn't cover. Basically just kind of all of the gaps in our insurance system, public and private, providing sort of a safety net fund for clinics so that they can serve those patients and be reimbursed for the full cost of the care. So that's one of the laws that is going to the governor. It was passed today. I don't really think there's any particular reason to doubt that the governor will sign it, but I still think it's really valuable for folks to, again, express their support for abortion. And I know that the folks who oppose these bills are often very loud and very well organized and coming to the Senate, coming to the legislature or calling in or busing people up to oppose abortion bills. So I do think this is a great thing to get folks involved, even though we are in California where we have really strong support. And then in addition, there's also some budget funds from the general budget bill that has already gone for this program. So that's a pretty good indication of where it's going. I think that is most of what I wanted to talk about here. I can also talk about Prop 1 if you'd like. Great. So the other bill, I guess that technically would have been the 16th bill that passed its way through the legislature this session, is a proposed constitutional amendment. And in order to amend the Constitution in California, you have to pass a bill through the legislature with 2/3 vote of each chamber. So that's already happened. And then it goes to the voters. And in November, all California voters will be able to vote on Prop 1, which will codify the right to abortion and birth control in the state constitution. And that only requires a simple majority. So as long as the majority of people in California vote for that, that's something that will be enshrined in our constitution after November. There's a lot of misinformation about what this prop will do or not do. We, as I mentioned, already have really strong abortion laws in California. California has in statute already a fundamental right to both access abortion and birth control. And then there's also was actually a California Supreme Court decision a couple of years before Roe v. Wade that found that the provisions of our specific constitution also provide for a right to abortion. So we have these protections. What Prop 1 will do is, instead of just having those protections be in a Supreme Court case interpreting the Constitution or in statute, which can be changed with just a simple majority vote through the legislature, it's going to be enshrined into the Constitution. It'll be harder to get rid of, just like it's harder to put something in the Constitution. And it'll keep, for example, if the California Supreme Court gets more conservative in the future, it'll keep them from doing a Dobbs-like decision where they overturn prior precedent. And that means that there's no longer a recognized constitutional right in California. What it's not going to do is allow abortions much later in pregnancy than current law does. Constitutional phrasing is usually really general, and then you have legislatures who come in and kind of be more specific about what it means. And there's nothing in the proposition that'll prohibit the legislature from regulating abortion the way that it does now. California law currently allows abortion through viability. It doesn't define viability on a time limit, because that's not how you measure viability of pregnancy. Pregnancies are viable. Gestational age is one piece of the factor, but you also have to think about like the specific medical characteristics of that pregnancy, and also kind of what access to what form of healthcare and medical procedures somebody might have if they did, for example, give birth prematurely. And so there's a number of factors, and that's how it's currently reflected in the law. That'll stay. We're still going to have that viability line. It's just going to put it in this really strongest form of protection in the state constitution. And so that is not one necessarily to call the governor about, but that will be on the ballot in November. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you all of our panelists for a lot of that great information and education. And we now want to open it up to everyone, a Q&A format, being able to ask any questions to the panelists generally or specifically if there are any questions.
And people on Zoom can also ask questions if you want to raise your hand, and then we can have you go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, these. Yeah. Okay, just go for it.
So is there anything to be done about crisis pregnancy centers? Your might remember national places to get abortion in the state.
Yes, they do, unfortunately. I don't know if maybe specifically in California, I believe they do. Nationally, yes, there are more crisis pregnancy centers. And crisis pregnancy centers are often religiously owned or operated centers that pretend to be medical centers. The vast majority of them don't have any medical professionals on staff, which actually allows them to get around a lot of
licensing and disclosure and ethical rules that apply to the medical profession. Like, for example, they don't have to comply with HIPAA. And they'll often be located in the same shopping center as an abortion clinic, for example. They'll sometimes have people out front trying to convince you that this is where your appointment is. And really their goal is to talk people out of abortions, often using misinformation and scare tactics. They also do sometimes provide diapers and things like that, but usually just for, a couple of months or something. They're not going to pay the cost of raising a child, for example. California had a law trying to kind of regulate crisis pregnancy centers that got struck down by the Supreme Court, in part because it was requiring them to tell people that they could get an abortion covered by Medi-Cal, and that California will help them pay for an abortion. And so that was found to be a free speech violation by the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the court has only gotten more hostile to abortion rights. But there is actually recently a proposed city ordinance by the city attorney here in Los Angeles. And it's really focused more on consumer protection. And so it specifically applies, it's limiting in that the person who could initiate this lawsuit against a crisis pregnancy center has to be somebody who was harmed by them. So went in and received misinformation or saw an advertisement that made them think they could go to that place to get medical care and they couldn't. And it has specific sanctions and fees for misleading consumers. And so that was a proposal from the city attorney. I believe that somebody on city council needs to pick up that bill and actually sponsor it. And then it would need to go through city council's normal lawmaking process. But I think that's more promising because it doesn't have that kind of free speech issue that the California-wide law did.
Do you know if there's difference in regulate medications for abortions in that we don't need to, we as physicians don't need to actually be the arbiters of who actually get them, given that take-home abortions have that are not medically monitored have the same efficacy and same safety without being monitored by a physician.
Yeah. 1 second, Robert. Would you mind just briefly repeating your question?
Sure.
Yeah.
My question would be about deregulating medications for abortions so that physicians don't have to be arbiters of giving them out, since they're safe without needing physicians monitoring them.
So yes, and we've started to see some action on that in part because of COVID, and then they made the COVID flexibilities more permanent. And so sometime in the last year, the FDA changed the REMS protocols for medication abortion so that you no longer had to physically be in person with somebody in order to administer the medication. And that's something that then whether or not that is a legal practice in a state will be determined by state to state law. And we've definitely seen some places try to prohibit that expanded ability to do telehealth for medication abortion. But under the FDA protocol, that's available now. And that's something that California has, and I believe is also trying to work to make sure that folks who are on Medicaid can get full reimbursement for that, despite not going into a clinic. And I think, as you mentioned, it's important to recognize that it is very safe. That's why the FDA is a progressive leading the charge entity on this. They've looked at years of data that show that if you just speak to somebody via Zoom and get sent a medication abortion pill, you're not going to have serious complications and it's very safe. And in part that is kind of evident because when you take anybody who has a medication abortion, even if they go to a clinic, they're going to be taking that second medication at home anyway. You're taking the two forms of medication anywhere from 24 to 72 hours apart. And so allowing people to do medication abortion via telehealth is not that different. And we also see we have a hand from one of our panelists.
Yeah, I see social as a hand. So.
Yeah, thank you. I'd also like to add that a lot of the work has already been done, and that California has been very proactive. So a law passed in 2019 is actually going to require that University of California and Cal State campuses will all start providing medication abortion beginning January 1st under a new state law. And so with that, it's going to only enhance access for students who normally do you use your parents' insurance? Do I get Medicaid, Medi-Cal? Like, it's going to help eliminate those barriers. And I'll, for the folks on the Zoom, I'll actually drop a link for you all because it's a really great thing that's going to be happening.
David Holtzman also has his hand raised, so you can unmute if you'd like.
Thanks. I wrote a question in the chat. I'm pretty concerned with what might happen if the federal government decides to outlaw abortion and come into the state and try and prosecute providers for of medical abortions that are needed for the women's health or general abortions in general. And this comes from having been involved a little bit in a case that outlawed medical marijuana at the state level. And I think it's current case law that the feds can come in to California, even though California legalized marijuana, has a pretty good marijuana climate, and prosecute medical marijuana, et cetera. So I'm wondering what sort of federal court advocacy is going on now that the court's changed quite a lot since the case called Rach, and how I might be able to help advocate some change to that precedent to guard against federal raids come time, which isn't so unlikely that the federal government gets taken over by what I call hostile forces here.
I can speak to that. So yeah,
I mean, California,
unfortunately,
just to clarify, California, I think it has a pretty good abortion environment right now. Okay, your suggestions for improving it are great, but I'm worried about the what happened even if those things pass and the feds outlaw it. Sorry.
no, thank you. Unfortunately, I don't have like a great answer to allay those fears. The Dobbs decision, although a lot of folks say it turned the abortion decision back to the states, what it actually said is that we are going to turn this question back to the people and their elected officials. And there's nothing in the decision that prohibits the federal government from banning abortion if they got the political willpower and the votes to do so. And as you sort of suggest with the medical marijuana case, the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. And so that's one place where they could potentially impact this. There's, I don't want to get too much into what interstate commerce means, but But if there is like a financial component, or if there are money or goods or medicines or people traveling between states, that's likely something that the federal government can regulate. And unfortunately, there isn't really anything to prohibit them from doing that. As you sort of suggest in your question, I think the like wall against that would be the federal court system. And as I've said, the federal court system is really hostile to all these kinds of rights. Anything that the conservative wing of our political system has opposed for the last decade or so, they have been putting judges into the federal court system to uphold those values. And so sort of, I think, suggested by your question, if we don't want that to happen, we are going to have to think about court reform. And there are a lot of folks who have been working in repro movements who have recently left litigating abortion rights, something they've done for years, and are now working on Supreme Court reform because they don't think that we're going to be able to really make progress. Even if you pass, for example, a right to abortion law through the federal government, this current Supreme Court is not going to uphold that. And so you got to think about the legislature, and you also have to think about the court system.
Yeah, so I haven't done a count recently, but actually some liberal justices were involved with the outlawing of medical marijuana in the Rage case, and they said they might have left the court. You might be able to convince some conservatives. I think they're also, the way to do it would be to frame abortion here in California as not being not involving interstate commerce, and you may be able to structure some abortion services that way, even for people who've come from out of state. Would love to talk with someone if anybody wants to get in touch with me about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I could ask another question. I did my feminist legal theory paper on Catholic healthcare directives. Would love to know what the state of California can do to require, despite those directives, Catholic health facilities to provide full reproductive health services, including abortions.
Yeah, there's a lot of like really complicated history, even with the UC system and Catholic health systems. Kind of like a background, Catholic hospitals now make up 1 out of 6 hospital beds in the United States, and in some places there are more than that. And they're required to provide medical care according to the ethical and religious directives, which is determined by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And if you want to get healthcare in a Catholic hospital that violates those directives, they have to apply to a bishop for an exemption from the policy. So a religious leader is making decisions about, for example, if somebody is miscarrying, but the fetus still has a heartbeat, are they allowed to intervene and end the pregnancy? Or is that too close to being an abortion, which is something that the ethical directives don't allow? They also often refuse to provide gender affirming care, dignity in dying care. They don't believe in birth control or sterilization. And so a lot of the time, kind of the standard of care is different. And for these parts, you don't meet the standard of care. You don't do what a kind of care you would get in another hospital. There are pretty strong in the law in various areas carve outs to allow religious entities to practice medicine in that way, either as a hospital or as an individual provider. You may hear sometimes about pharmacists refusing to fill Plan B prescriptions or things like that. Sometimes they're required to refer you to another provider. Whether or not they actually do that, people don't always comply with the law. I don't have a good answer on how necessarily we can do that. I think the extent to which religious exemptions are allowed in all forms of healthcare and non-discrimination laws and all sorts of things like that is something that is going to be in the Supreme Court coming forward. It's something that they keep taking cases on and kind of chipping away at non-discrimination laws and rules about providing healthcare. And again, unfortunately, we have a federal court system and a Supreme Court that thinks that if I have to bend in any way from my Christian beliefs for you, my religious rights are being violated. And so I don't, again, unfortunately, think that we're going to make too much progress on that right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's also why we need to really be focused on more of the local and state resources that we can kind of control, because as we saw, like the federal government isn't going to save us, like we're going to have to save ourselves. And the way that we can exert the most power and influence is going to be starting at that local and statewide levels. Even with all of the pro-abortion bills that are going through legislative right now, we saw several counties in California come to their city councils saying that they wanted to restrict abortion access by closing down clinics or making all these rules. And due to people advocating and showing up being like, no, we're not going to do that, those were shut down. It also looks like there's a hand raised in the chat here.
Daniel, do you want to?
Yeah, this is Daniel. I used to be in the room, but then I had to go. I just had a question in the chat about interstate liability via telemedicine or by a patient who comes from a state where abortion is now illegal or basically illegal, and what we're to think and expect on that end.
I only know a little bit about this. Typically, in order to practice telemedicine, it is the same as practicing medicine. So somebody who's licensed to practice medicine in California can't just see patients in Texas because they're doing it via Zoom. And so that's one piece.
The other thing in terms of like risk of liability that I think providers should be aware of is especially states with these kind of vigilante laws that allow lawsuits against people for providing abortions, like the Texas SB 8 law, for example. They don't have limitations based on the location of the provider. And so if you are seeing somebody in Texas, I mean, just because you know, again, people don't always comply with the law. And I think especially right now with the mess that we're living in, folks are becoming comfortable with how far they're willing to go to help people get abortions on either side of the law. But so if there's a provider in California who is seeing somebody via telehealth in Texas, they could be sued. If somebody flies from Texas to California, gets an abortion and goes back, that provider in California could be sued. One thing that people are doing to kind of get around that is mail forwarding, which is more about not shipping the pills into a jurisdiction where abortion is legal. And so somebody could see a provider via telehealth, send the medication abortion to a PO box in a state where abortion is legal, and then have those pills forwarded to them so that the person providing the medication isn't shipping the pills into a jurisdiction where it's illegal. You know, is that going to save you? I don't know. I wouldn't like it. This is not legal advice, but that is something that folks are talking about now to kind of get around some of these barriers from state to state.
I'll also plug that there are resources like Hey Jane, and Plan C pills, and there's also Abortion on Demand that can kind of like answer those questions a little bit better, and how they kind of, you know, also not legal or medical advice is how they're able to do that, is most of them operate in like Canada or a different country where all of the restrictions that we have in the US aren't on them.
Yeah, and as you're mentioning that too, I also will say, in terms of sort of getting legal information, or if you're afraid that you might be facing criminalization or a civil lawsuit, definitely reach out to somebody. If When How has a wonderful legal helpline. They work primarily with folks who are managing their own abortion, so self-managed abortion, which would be the category someone would fall into if they ordered pills on the internet or something like that. But if that isn't the specific case, then they can also refer you to somebody who can help you make the most informed decision based on the laws of your state.
David Colson, you have another question?
Just to follow up on it, I would love to know how much inquiry a provider actually has to do into the state of residence or of a patient or where that person's coming from. Are no questions asked clinics allowed? Can you do telehealth without checking on the geocoding of the originating server, you know, things like that? Can you do it anonymously, essentially, or anonymously with regards to address?
Yeah, your malpractice would not, like if you weren't confirming location, like malpractice sort of malpractice would require that you're confirming location, because again, it's so from a psychiatrist perspective, right? If my patient lives in California, but travels to Texas for like a month, but is coming back to California, I can treat them while they're in Texas because they're traveling. But if they brought a lawsuit against me in Texas, for whatever reason, my malpractice would not cover it. So it's like people still do it, but it's a little risky. But so I don't think no insurance carrier would go for that, which theoretically would be what you would need to use if you did eventually get sued. So you would just kind of be out on your own, I think. Is that?
What about in person in California with a Texan patient?
In person, I think there would be I mean, you're allowed to treat whoever comes to your office. They're in California when they're getting services. The problem is that if they went back to Texas, you could not have any treatment with them. Although I don't know with vigilante laws, that would still probably be fraught, but like people will travel to like UCLA to get healthcare, and that's okay. You just can't have a continuing relationship with them if they're not coming to your office. It got really blurry during telehealth.
Yeah.
Before it was like, if you're here, it's fine. But then with telehealth, it's much more confusing.
Okay,
And to reiterate that, the Future of Abortion Council actually passed legislation of AB 1666 that actually covers protections for providers in California providing abortion care, as long as you are in California. Like if you are a provider traveling out of California to assist somebody, then that law does not protect you.
Yeah, and kind of on that same thing, I mean, I think part of the problem too is that like a vigilante law is the kind of the opposite of the way that the legal system usually works. It's allowing somebody who has not been harmed in any way and might not even know the person they're suing or have ever met them or have met the person that they gave an abortion to. It really just empowers anybody to sue anybody. And it's not really clear if that in itself is a constitutional scheme. You know, in theory, there are a bunch of different rules about what states owe to each other in terms of enforcing judgments from other states. But none of that case law is really specific to this situation. Usually what you would have is like a judgment, like for example, if somebody in Texas had a judgment against them for hitting somebody's car and not paying, and that person fled to Arizona, the state of Arizona could help enforce that judgment, even though it's from a Texas state court. But it's a really rare situation where you have something that is maybe considered a murder in one state and is considered healthcare in another. And then how do those state laws interact, and what does the state have to do if the thing is not a crime where they are? So that's something I expect to see going through the federal courts, and kind of all of this of like, how do you navigate it is sort of just in the meantime, how people can protect themselves.
Daniel, you have another question?
Yeah, that's a question going back to the Turnaway study and maybe any other similar studies or subsequent studies. But I guess, is there anything that we learned about the gestational age or the point in pregnancy? Because I know you mentioned one of the groups was like first trimester patients.
Yeah, so the gestational age for the near limit group, the one that was just before the cutoff, the average was 19.7 weeks. The gestational age average for the turnaway group that gave birth later was 23.1 weeks. The turnaway no birth group that either had a miscarriage or received an abortion elsewhere, that was 18.9 weeks. And then there was that comparison group of the first trimester abortions, and that was an average of 7.6 weeks. All of these are, you know, higher averages, at least, than a lot of the new state laws that have, you know, tried to restrict abortion in the preceding Dobbs and in the wake of Dobbs. So.
Although, yeah, this study was specifically trying to capture that. So it was looking for within 150 miles of San Francisco, where they were doing the study, they were looking for the latest term limits in that area because they were trying to capture people who might present right after or right before. Mm-hmm. So that was part of the point. Yeah.
Does it say how they determine the age of gestation?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually don't know. Oh, repeating the question. There's a question about how the gestational age was determined in the study. And actually, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, whether it was last menstrual period or dating by, you know, sonogram.
I would imagine it was for something. I imagine it would be dating by sonogram for something as like so. You can have an abortion, you can't. You're 2 days over. I would imagine. Hopefully, who knows.
Okay. There's a question in the chat as well that I can read out loud. It's by Devin. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Golasiewski. I hope I'm saying this correctly. But I'll just read your question if that's okay. He asked, I was wondering about about the kinds of support which exist or being planned for people coming to California out of state to have an abortion. Is there evidence yet about certain counties which will be especially impacted by this? About the financial challenges of travel and housing. I understand that Access Reproductive Justice does work on this.
Yes, I'd be happy to take that. Thank you so much, Devin, for your question. We've already seen an increase of folks coming into California for care, especially after SB 8 last year. And we're seeing that folks are coming here regardless if there's a clinic that might be closer to them, mostly because we're able to have more providers that are able to get appointments sooner, as well as we're seeing that some folks are telling like their employer, like, hey, I'm taking a quick vacation, when really they're accessing healthcare. Whereas if they were going to another clinic in another state, it's like, oh, you went to Kansas for vacation? Okay. And that's why we're seeing that a lot of folks are already coming into California. And we're also seeing that with the Future of Abortion Council bills, is we're trying to get some of that money to help provide for the infrastructure that is coming in. And a lot of folks that we saw in terms of like pushback are, why are you going to use our California dollars to pay for out of state people's abortions? And to that, we were saying that all the abortions that are being paid for with the tax dollars are supporting California infrastructure. So they're supporting hotels, they're supporting local grocery stores that we're getting food for them, flights that are coming in. Like these are all California employees that are also benefiting from this and having that money stay in the state versus going to another state. And we are also that there are certain counties that have gestational limits. I was just reading your question again, that have certain gestational limits that go to a higher amount. Like there is one actually in Calabasas in LA County that has one of the higher gestational limit ages. And so we see also folks traveling inside of California for care, depending on why they needed to wait so long. And at the same time, they don't need to tell us why they waited so long. Like we're just there to help them.
Yeah, and then there was one part of the question too about where people are coming, and as you just suggested, LA County is definitely a big one. There is research that shows that people may travel further distances, especially if they think they're going to be protected legally. And so all those bills that we just talked about means that maybe more people will be coming to California because they're less afraid of getting sued or their medical records getting turned over if they do get sued. But a big factor is travel distance. And so just kind of based on the lineup of where people are located, where states are located that are banning abortion, and what states, especially up the west, really the coasts, will continue to allow abortion. We're expecting a large number of people to be coming from Arizona. And so those folks will most likely be coming to LA County. And in our report, we estimated that as much as half of the people coming to California for abortion could be coming to LA County specifically.
I can also do a shameless plug for Access Reproductive Justice. Last year tried to do a campaign called Fund Abortion LA through the County Board of Supervisors. And the County Board of Supervisors was like, well, there's state money coming. And so it's still a campaign that we actively still want to get. And we'll probably reinvigorate that again this fall. So be on the lookout for that, because LA County, they're coming. And also there are folks who have family members or a friend that lives in California. And so you have an accessibility issue. You now have a family or friend that's able to help you. And you also have that security in terms of like legal ramifications in your home state. And so all these things are just kind of intersecting in a web of care that we're trying to navigate. And I'll also point back to that map I dropped earlier about the Center for Reproductive Rights. That map changes every day. And it is one to really like enhance how tricky it is to navigate this landscape right now.
I can ask a question. And so Julie, I know you kind of actually touched on this before when you were talking about ways we can destigmatize abortion by just using the word abortion. And so my question is really just, what are some misconceptions people have about abortion access? And what are some helpful ways that we can combat such misconceptions and communicate more effectively?
Yes, I think the biggest thing that I have found in working in abortion funding is how many folks don't know about abortion funds. And most people are familiar with Planned Parenthood health centers, that they work in we work in correlation with health centers as well as independent clinics. And so that's usually how folks find out about us, is they make their appointment and then they learn of the cost. And so, for instance, if you were not able to have Medi-Cal for whatever reason, or you don't have insurance, you don't want your spouse, your parent to know, gender expansiveness, you're being told, hey, it's going to be around $500 to $600. And you're like, where am I going to get this? And usually, how I mentioned before, of folks having this interlapping and intersectional approach of like, there's multiple barriers that these people are facing. And so with that is just learning about abortion funds and the cost, and how everyone assumed that just because abortion is legal, it's accessible. And it hasn't been accessible. It hasn't, and not until it's free, essentially. And that's going to be the way that our advocacy is just going to continue to be uplifted. We also know that abortion funds are primarily run by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as LGBTQ folks. And so with that, there tends to be a lot less of the marketing and hearing about us. And so because we're focused on the actual problem and focused on resolving the problem, which is abortion access. So yeah, just, and being invited to these spaces like this, always happy to talk about abortion funding and abortion access to whoever wants to hear it. I'm sure my dog is also tired of me talking about it, but it's just something that I love to do, and just wanting to make sure that folks just know about us and just getting our word out there. And access has been around for 30 years. And it's just been a great way to show that, like, we've been here, we're not going anywhere, and we'll continue to be here for folks.
All right, I love the enthusiasm with the questions. We have another question in the chat. I'll read out loud from Lala Forest. Am I saying your name correctly? Okay. Yes, yes. Okay, good. All right. So the question is, how can we ensure equity in funding allocated to cover travel costs for individuals who come from underrepresented communities who don't have insurance or fewer resources?
That's going to be the biggest one. Of usually they'll find out about abortion funding and abortion funds through their health center and making their appointment. And when I had mentioned earlier to just talk about and like destigmatize the word abortion, like when you have a friend that they might be pregnant, they don't want to be pregnant, and yet people are, not talking about it in this like stigma environment that has been created over the years. By just saying the word, they might be able to like, hey, do you know of any way and any resources? And so that's usually when like folks call us, and we try and prioritize undocumented folks, because we don't care about immigration status. It's something that all abortion funds really kind of have as their base layer, is borders are made up essentially, and it comes from a different type of angle. But most of these places that folks are coming from are already underrepresented, and they're already not being able to afford an abortion. And that is a different approach than when you get into like upper middle class to wealthy folks seeking abortion care, where they're like, oh, $500. All right, I could do that. Oh, a pill, a plane ride, I got that. And so by just knowing that there are resources available, and things like the Future of Abortion Council, as well as just advocacy in general, has been to just let those folks in those communities know. And I may sound like a broken record, and I just have to remember that when in reminding folks that if you sound like a broken record and you think I've been saying this so much, but to somebody, this is the first time that they've heard that. This is the first time they've heard about an abortion fund. This is the first time they've heard somebody saying the word abortion out loud. And so just to remind yourself that, like, if it sounds like you've been saying it a lot, keep doing it. You're doing a great job.
Some of the participants having to leave. Do you want to put the action sheet up and
Yeah.
discuss that now? And we can still have questions.
That sounds good. Yeah.
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 We can still do questions. But
All
have that
right.
up there.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I can just change the slide. Click this one. Trying to make it a presentation. Oh. There. All right. Okay, so you can scan this using your phone. It's a QR code that goes to our policy and change action sheet, which we mentioned before. It's a list of different action items we can take to really try to make an impact in terms of reproductive health justice. So we can go through the action sheet together.
And this was a combination of effort from our panelists who have pulled together some great resources that you can kind of run through and look at, and included are a lot of the things that were mentioned today, as well as the turnaway study that was talked about. And at the top, you'll see a couple of national petitions from Planned Parenthood and ACLU. And those are like very, very easy action items that you can do. Just sign your name along and support, and you can read more about those petitions on those links. Earlier, Xochitl talked about this article, which I think is a really powerful read. We don't need abortion underground railroad. And that's from the Access Executive Director. And then there's also a link to UCLA Center on Reproductive Health Law and Policy and their study that Ms. Cohen talked about earlier.
Yeah, and then there's also a list of e-newsletters you can join. This includes Access Reproductive Justice. There's also a volunteer sign-up form if you want to volunteer for their organization. There's the UCLA Center on Reproductive Health, Law and Policy, the Allen Guttnature Institute, Center for Reproductive Rights, National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, NARAL, Pro-Choice California, and Physicians for Reproductive Health. So there's so many e-newsletters to join to stay informed and become more active. And then there's organizations to join as well. There's UACT, which a lot of the residents know about or might not know about at UCLA. It's a cross-specialty resident faculty advocacy collaborate. And so there's an email there if you want to email to become involved. I actually think that we have, let me see if I can switch this. There we go. There are some more QR codes here, and we'll go through this as well. And then another organization to join is UCLA's Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights. And you can join their listserv. There's an email there. And this is used to share reproductive related events and information across departments at UCLA. Okay, and then also don't forget to vote in the November election. We talked about Proposition 1 coming up in November. You can vote yes on Prop 1. That's a state constitutional amendment. And there's a link to a fact sheet over there.
And then finally, Ms. Cohen talked about this earlier, but AB 2134, I think some of your questions were related to this, and it's a law that, as we've talked about, is going to support people with lower incomes and those facing financial barriers to accessing abortion. And so we wanted to highlight this law because we think it's particularly important as California is going to be a safe haven for people coming here and being able to access care. So we encourage you to call Governor Newsom and encourage him to sign the bill into law. But we're excited that it's made it to his desk.
Yes. All right. Okay. And yeah, you can use the phone script here, which can be helpful, you know, when making your calls. All right, any questions so far?
So for organizing.
Yeah.
This is fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming, and really special thank you to all our panelists. I've been really inspired by your passion and how like this was so informative, you know, and yeah, I hope we can all carry forward with this and take some action with our action sheets.
And can we give a special thanks to Hillary and Jen? I mean, not only did they do so much work in organizing this event, but they also managed the tech in the middle of the event, which I don't know if you can see it in the background. It's really something. So.
But also thank you to Dr. Castillo. We would not have been able to put this on without his guidance and learning a lot about like direct policy advocacy. And, you know, as CGP, we want to continue to try to have events like this. So if people want support as they're working on events, then they can always come to us. And then just one more time to thank our panelists. We really, really appreciate your insights. And as we can tell, everyone is like so hungry for that knowledge. And so we really appreciate you guys being here and spending a Wednesday evening doing this with us.
I just really want to encourage everyone, before you go, please scan the action sheet and, you know, even just call the governor right now. I mean, I did it as I was walking over here. It took me a couple minutes. It's really easy to do. And also sign some of those national petitions. Taking action, I think, right now will help you build that momentum so you can continue to take action after this event too. So I really want to encourage you, like this event was very powerful, but not to just take it in, but also to act as well. So please do that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all.
Got to do that.